strong enough.
Yeah, good thing you chose an easy spot. Chapter 6. No, it wasn't just easy to go through the portal. The moment that I aligned them, I couldn't see anything through the portal. It was on the same level of complexity as the world of Saramea. We'd been learning some things here and there about traveling and everything else. Regardless, we'd learned that it's possible to get through these portals. It's just tougher. However, with my strong traveling ability and with destiny to help me where I lacked, I was able to open it fine. And from that point, the seers were able to hold the worlds in overlap and keep it open for everyone else. Our travelers were very strong. Scar, surprisingly, was not a very strong traveler. She was the one who taught me, though, so she'll still be able to hold that over my head. Regardless, we made our way through this portal, and frigid air filled my lungs as I came through to the other side. I was glad I'd been able to bring this force through with me, and I was glad that our travelers had been training. Hopefully they'd be able to get out all of these people that we needed to evacuate because they were being attacked by the Profithians. I looked around the log room around us. It must have been a meeting place of some kind. There were pews of some sort, and we made our way around. The seer guard had gathered near the door, and they were ready, at attention, scared, but ready. Now they'd done fighting before. During nightfall, they fought into my cry, but that didn't mean they weren't worried here. However, I was not going to get them into the fighting. I needed them here to evacuate. Scar and I would do the fighting. I explained just as much to them. I pointed to the two different people. I said, Tikor's group, pointing to the 5 that I had split into the one group to build a tower. I said, you turn left, evacuate all of the houses to the left of this building. Tarenta's group, turn to the right, do the same there. Leave the front row of buildings for me. I'll take care of those. But everything else, get to that second row as fast as you can and start evacuating. Get them back here. The Profithians, I could feel, hadn't attacked yet, like Scar said they had. But I could feel their presence here. I could feel a dampening of destiny that I couldn't quite feel him to the right side. I studied everyone and gave orders to the traveler that was here on this side. I said the other 2 will hold the portal open from that side, but I need you to stay here and keep getting people through to help them get where they need to be. And yeah. And the seer guard would be nearby. I gave orders to the seers to stay as spread apart as they could, to give Destiny room to work, and he would protect them and give them what they needed. Being in stressful circumstances kind of helped with that as well. There was a self-preservation kind of thing with Destiny that he'd snap on and protect the seers if they needed it. That was the only reason I was willing to let them do what we needed to do that, and we just needed somebody, because I couldn't evacuate this place on my own. At about that time, a small form burst through the door, sending Snow in through the door, and Snow caught all up in her windswept red hair. Scar explained that the army was getting close. They were a few thousand in number. Not good odds. But Scar had been known to do some incredible things. And we had to do it. We didn't have much choice in the matter. I nodded to her and went out with her and sent the seer guard off to start evacuating. Scar and I made our way through the deep snow. It was up to our knees in places, and the blizzard was raging around us. The sky was gray, and snow was just falling in sheets and kept getting in my eyes as we made our way forward. My thin button-down shirt didn't do much to block out the cold, but I had Featherlife, and humming Featherlife's note, I was able to warm myself up enough that I would be okay. It also helped sharpen my senses and fill me with energy so I'd be ready for this fight. Scar said, "All right, what's the plan?" I explained that we had the Seer Guard evacuating people. Scar and I just needed to stop the Profithians. I said, I can feel they have anti-searing technology of some kind. We need to take that out first thing. I won't be able to sire until that's gone. Once that's gone, we should be fine. But we need to take care of that because I can't reach Destiny here. And she said, oh yeah, we can take care of that. About that time, I heard a voice calling out my name and turned back to see Blaze running through the snow, and Ferendo was on his back. Ferendo was the one calling, not Blaze. But Ferendo came up and he was puffing and he said, geez, I felt something was wrong, and I guess Blaze did too. He came and took me here. He said, what do you need us doing? And he said, well, the first row of houses from the Profithians needs to be evacuated. Do you think you can do that? And he nodded. He said, I'm scared, but if you think I can do it, I'll try. I couldn't help but think he's going to be a good leader for the Seer Guards. And I said, yes, if you can do that, that would be wonderful. We'll take care of the Profithians. You just get these people out of here, this first row of houses, and then push inward as much as you can. And he nodded, and a voice behind him said, yeah, let's do it. And that voice made me pause. Andrew's head popped out from behind Ferendo. I said, no, you are going straight back to Sarah May, young man. And he said, what? He said, you're letting Ferendo go, and he just started his training today. He said, I'm not that far behind him. Why can't I be here? And I said, I'm not having this conversation. You're going back right now. And he started to protest, and I said, you can watch my video feed if you want. And I pulled my mobile out of my scabbard and clipped it to my front. And he still protested to that. I said, Ferendo, take him back. And Blaze whinnied and reared up, and Andrew had to grab on so he didn't fall off, and Blaze charged right off back through the snow, leaving a smaller indent of snow he'd been melting it where he'd been standing. But he took him back, and I shook my head. And Scar said, man, when did you get so bossy? I said, when my friends started trying to kill themselves. I said, tell me you wouldn't do the same. She said, no, I don't disagree with you. It just, authority looks good on you, G. I said, stop trying to distract me. We continued to forge our way through the snow, and I could see through the blizzard a haze of green along the far end of the of the village, the town that was here. At the end of the log homes covered in snow, I could see the green, and as we made our way forward, it continued to grow. Scar explained that the Profithians were still gathering, but she said that they were pretty well organized by the time that she got there, so it wouldn't be long at all before they began to attack. I said, all right, then we're just going to have to go stop them. I felt out with Destiny. I could feel 7 or 8 different places that where Destiny just couldn't, he just couldn't make out those places, and I could tell that I just couldn't sire here. I pointed out the places to Scar. I said, I'll take the few closest to us if you want to take the ones farthest away. She said, do you want to borrow my medals? I said, if I could. She reached out and took my hand. And I sang into Feather Life. I had been continually singing here and there to keep up the power coming through the ring. But as I held her hand and I sang into Feather Life, I could feel the power transfer from her to me. And I reached into my scabbard and pulled out a vial of medals that Scar had given me. I had a small stash of them for exactly this kind of thing. I pulled off the stopper and drank down the medals like the metal dust that was floating in a Dr. Pepper solution. I grimaced at the medals going down my throat, but I could feel them with Scar's abilities, ready to give me power. I felt into one of the metal reserves. I wasn't sure which one it was. She hadn't taught me the metals. I could just feel them, though, and through practice I'd gotten them. I couldn't remember them on my own, though. But I reached into one of the stores and began to burn it and felt a warmth within me. And suddenly my senses snapped to a higher level. I could see through the snow further than I'd been able to before. I could see the green. I could barely make out the first row of Profithians. We made our way to the edge of the houses, and faced the army. About that time I could hear galloping behind me. I could tell that Frendo was coming back and was gonna make his way through the houses and evacuate. That was good. That helped me focus more on the army and making it so we could all sire better. With that, I gave Scar a kiss and wished her luck. And I pulled a bunch of coins from my scabbard, dropped one to the ground, and pushing off of it with Scar's magic, I shot off into the sky and aimed myself to land on one of the spots that I couldn't sense with destiny. I slammed down on a metal thing, making out the Profithians that were around me. I pulled out Talonthorn and I cut them down and looked down at the machine that was underneath me. It was completely covered in metal, and there was a thrumming sound coming from inside. I could tell there were crystals inside, the anti-searing crystals that they had going on. And after cutting down the Profithians, I stabbed Talonthorn down into the metal, singing its note to give it strength and sharpness to help me cut through the metal. As it cut through, I could hear crystals breaking underneath. And as the crystals made their way around this inner chamber, I could hear them beating against Talonthorn, but it wasn't enough to shut down the machine. And I had to dodge to the side as the Profithians to the side of me began to shoot at me, because I was breaking down the machine, took down a few Profithians. I had to dodge, and that I didn't have Destiny to help me with, but I had Scar's medals, and her future sight ability came in handy. I had never studied with it, but something in the abilities helped me use the information that I was getting. I dodged to the side and tried to maneuver Talonthorn back and forth, and it wouldn't break the machine. And testing out, I sang into Talonthorn, releasing energy into the blade, and I could feel something begin to build up within the machine. I sang out louder, throwing myself to the top of the machine to evade more blasts as the Profithians began to converge on me. I sang out loud enough that I could feel the machine begin to burst, and I pulled Talonthorn out and threw myself to the ground just as it exploded, throwing metal and crystal shrapnel all over. I took a few hits, but nothing serious. I came to the ground as the machine went dark, and the Profithians rushed around me to take me down. They weren't going to shoot when I was in the middle of their ranks, but they pulled out blades and began to attack at me. And I used Talonthorn to block two blades as I pulled myself up, relying solely on Scar's abilities to save myself. Now, at this point, I could feel Destiny a little bit better, but I still not enough to sire. And I couldn't fight through these Profithians. I still held some of the coins and dropped one to the ground as I pushed against it and tried to shoot myself up into the air and away from the Profithians and away from their blades. I shot up into the air, but lurched as one of the Profithians caught my foot, and the others raised their blades and tried to get me with them, while another kicked at my anchor from underneath, making me wobble in the air. I was not going to be able to fight them like this. And so reaching for one of the metals that I hadn't used very often, and Scar warned against using very much. But it seemed the time to use it, and I burned it, and suddenly the metal that I'd been using to push against everything else was completely gone, used in an instant. The Profithians underneath me flattened to the ground as I rocketed into the sky, barely able to keep my eyes closed against the whipping wind and the snow that came slashing down at me. I flew up into the air to the point that I couldn't even see the army underneath me. And I had enough time in the air to reach for another vial of metals because I'd used up the one that Scar had given me. I drank it down as I began to fall and pulled another series of coins from my scabbard. As I came down, I used a coin or two to redirect myself and pulled myself onto the second machine. Before I hit the machine, I released the handful of coins that I'd been using and shot them downward into the machine, but it wasn't enough to break the metal hull until I used the force against the metals to stop myself in the air, and that ripped the coins through the metal, and I could hear them shatter against the crystals underneath. I dropped down onto the metal there, and again it wasn't enough to destroy the machine, and the Profithians were on me in an instant, trying to stop me from breaking down this machine. But as I put a foot against the machine and pulled the coins back towards me, I could feel them hit resistance, some kind of grouping of metal, or grouping of crystals. As I pulled further, I heard something shatter inside and the machine went dark. I ducked to the ground to evade some more blasts, but at this point, as the machine died down, destiny became present enough that I was able to sire. Scar had taken down some other machines while I'd been working on these. And with that, and with the metals, I was unstoppable. I reached out to destiny, and everything turned into lines of light. I was able to make out every individual point around me, and I was able to manipulate them. I threw myself off of the machine, throwing Profithians down into the snow around me. I wasn't going to kill them if I didn't have to. And so I raced my way through the army, throwing snow mentally over the Profithians and burying them, crushing guns, and just racing my way through. Now, Scar and I had caused some chaos, but in the chaos, the Profithian leaders must have launched the attack, and so the front lines had already begun to hit the first row of houses. And I wasn't sure how much Ferendo and the others had been able to manage by this point, but I had to stop them. And I used Scar's magic to push against the metals. I don't use her magic a lot, and so it's kind of confusing to talk about sometimes. Regardless, I used her magic to push against metals to shoot through the air as I threw Profithians down and buried them in snow and crushed their guns and just did everything I could to stop them and to slow them down. I finally got to the line of houses and pushed against a lamppost that was there, throwing myself to the side as I made my way over the houses. I got to a point where the Profithians were harrying a group of these Skanoran people, of the villagers. I landed down, and in the Skanoran dialect, which I could only speak because of destiny, I told the Skanorans to get to the center of this city, and that we'd get them out of here and we'd stop the Profithians. As I did, I swept away a group of Profithians, and the families and villagers nearby ran toward the center of the city. One Profithian pulled out a knife and went to attack a family, and so I engaged her. I could have, just knocked her down like the rest, but sometimes you gotta fight somebody one-on-one. I leapt forward with Talonthorn and knocked her knife out of the way, and the Profithian growled at me and said something in Profithian that I will not repeat here. I understood it though, and the Profithian went to attack me. I blocked her blade and reached out with destiny to stop her midair, to stop the force of her knife coming down with an equal force pushing against it to just freeze her where she stood. And I could feel her anger as she tried to force against me. but it wasn't enough to stop it. And I reached out, barely knowing what I was doing. I still did not understand what siring even meant at this point, but drawing energy from the worlds around me, I sent them into the knife, making it heat up and begin to glow. And the Profithian cried out and dropped the dagger, and I released her as she stepped back, holding a semi-burnt hand. She swore at me again and raced back to the Profithian lines. At this point, I felt destiny decrease. In some degree, I wasn't able to feel him and sire the same way that I'd been able to, and I turned to see Ferendo riding Blaze, who was running into the area. And he was shouting to a group of youth, directing them to the center of the town. As he got near me, though, he couldn't sire as well either, and the language of the Scanorans left him, and he resorted to just pointing and shouting at them to go. They followed his directions as he turned and saw me, and he came over with a grin on his face. His face was a deeper shade of blue. The tips of his nose and ears were nearly purple in the cold. Even riding Blaze, being so close to the fire. But he said, "Gee, this is incredible. I wasn't even able to sire this morning, and now I'm saving these people." I couldn't help but smile. It felt so good to be able to sire and to be able to do something. He said, "Also, this Nimbostratus is incredible." He looked up at the clouds, and it is a pretty crazy blizzard, huh? And he said, "Yeah." He's like, that's right. I asked him how well we'd been able to evacuate people, and his face fell a little bit. He said, "I wasn't able to get to all of the houses before the Profithians. Most everybody's out, and, we're on to the second and third rows houses, but we did lose some." I said it had to happen. We're doing the best that we can. I said, "Keep going. Follow Destiny's orders, and when everyone's out or when Destiny tells you to go back, and we'll get ourselves out of here. In the meantime, just get away from each other so we can sire better." He nodded and urged Blaze off. As they went off, I thought, man, Blaze, just let him ride. I feel like most horses wouldn't do that, but Blaze is... he's a special one. Regardless, I turned back to the evacuation. And as Ferendo went off, I could feel Destiny come back to some degree, but not as much as he should have, not as much as before. There was still something blocking me. As I turned around, I could feel it coming from the edges of the houses where the Profithian army was. And readying Talonthorn, I stepped forward, and I could hear a humming, along with like a mechanical clanking sound, and realized there was something out there. And as I used Scar's metals, I could see out into the snow to where a mechanical thing came into view. It was in the shape of... It was a humanoid shape, but with definitely like Profithian proportions. 10 feet tall. And I could see the Profithian inside the mech suit. The thing was glowing with green lights all over. The silvery metal stained with a red, fiery-looking design. The one arm ended in a 6-fingered mechanical hand, and the other ended in a massive gun that the Profithian was using to shoot at houses. I was going to have to face this thing myself. It had anti-searing technology of some kind, but I had Scar's metals, and I had my own weapons. I could take this thing. As it came forward, I threw myself into the air, throwing coins behind me to launch myself at the Profithian. As I drew close, I pulled myself against it to throw myself even faster through the air. As I came near, I pushed against it and dropped into the snow a foot or two. As the blizzard raged against me. My jeans by this point were soaked through, but I had Feather Life and Talonthorn and Scar's magic to keep me warm. I was fine. I faced this Profithian, and it shot at me as I approached, but I used Talonthorn to absorb the blast, singing into it to absorb the energy and channel it into myself. And then what happens? Oh no, I'm blanking. I hate when this happens. That's right. I tried to get in close to cut at the Profithian, but it came with lightning fast jabs. It was definitely enhanced by this suit, and I was able to dodge out of the way as I tried to break crystals, green crystals that were powering it all throughout the hull. But I wasn't fast enough, and as I ducked under one of the arms, I didn't catch the other, and it caught me along the side and threw me in the air into a building nearby. My head hit the building, and I sank down into the snow. My vision went black for a moment and took my breath away. As I hit the snow, I could feel feather life keeping me alive, and the power healed the cracks in my ribs and brought me back to alertness, just in time to pull myself out of the cold snow as the Profithian's foot came down. And I came to face it, but just at that point, feather life ran out. The stone in it ran out of power, and everything cut out. The world grew dark around me, and the cold cut in immediately. I could feel it. The wet and the damp were freezing. And with feather life's power went Scar's abilities. I couldn't use the metals anymore, and I couldn't sire. I still had Talonthorn, but that wasn't going to be enough. I tried to get out of the way, but the Profithian used an arm to knock me to the ground and grabbed me by the face with the mechanical hand. And the pressure was unbearable as the Profithian stood on top of me and gripped my head with its hand. I reached out, dropping Talonthorn, and tried to pry the fingers off, but I did not have the strength that I'd had before and couldn't do it on my own. As I cried out and the Profithian began to lift me into the air by my head, I held on to the top of its hand, and the light from the crystals was glaring into my eyes. Light from crystals that were used to power the Profithian suit. I realized feather life had used up its power, but there was power in these crystals. And if I could possibly find their, I always forget what it's called, resonant frequency, I could maybe draw power from the crystals. And as I cried out, I tried to focus enough to raise my voice to hit as many notes as I could. As I went up, I could feel a flash of power heal me and take away the pain a touch. I lowered my voice again until I found the note where power began to course into me, and I could feel the crystal vibrating underneath me. Once I found the note, I cried out as loud as I could and felt a surge of power, enough that I was able to bring my arm around and underneath the arm, and drawing strength from the crystal as much as I could, I sheared the hand off of the arm and dropped to the ground as the Profithian screamed out in pain. I dropped to the ground and pulled the gauntlet off of me, reaching to another of the crystals, and they were all similar enough shape that I was able to get the note for this one. And I shouted out as loud as I could, drawing energy from it, and wheeling around, slamming the Profithian across the front with my elbow. It was enough to dent the metal and throw the Profithian back into the building nearby. As I stepped forward, I ripped the last crystal from the gauntlet and sang, not quite as loud, not draining all of the energy, but singing into it as I stepped forward and drawing enough strength that as the Profithian tried to raise its gun, I kicked it out of the way and grabbed the front of the suit and ripped it off, leaving the Profithian inside a piece of broken circuitry. The Profithian was injured, but they'd live. I left them to scramble back to the army as I pulled another crystal from the suit, picked up Talonthorn, and went off to meet the others and make sure that the evacuation had happened the best way that we could make it happen. End of chapter 6.